What would you do if a mission to save a life led you to discover the most heart-wrenching twist of fate? A Special Forces soldier did just that. But this wasn't just about rescuing a K9. It was about confronting a past he thought he'd left behind. Before I show you what happened next, can I ask you something small? Most people scroll past our stories, but your one click could help this message reach someone who truly needs it, so please tap that subscribe button. Special Forces soldiers are no strangers to danger, loss, and the unimaginable bond between them and their K9 partners. But for Sergeant James Carter, a routine mission to rescue an injured dog would soon unravel a story far more personal than he ever expected. In this emotional journey, we'll follow James as he uncovers a powerful connection that not only changes his life, but reopens the door to a friendship he thought was gone forever. James Carter had been a soldier long enough to know that every mission was a gamble, but this one was different. He was part of an elite team of Special Forces operators, tasked with what seemed like a routine extraction. But as they made their way through the dense, humid jungle, a sense of foreboding gripped him, the kind of feeling that came only when things weren't going according to plan. The team's mission was to extract a military K9 named Shadow. This highly trained dog had been injured during a skirmish while protecting his handler in an operation gone wrong. Now James and his team had to get to him before the enemy did. There was no question that the dog needed immediate medical attention, but the real danger wasn't just the injuries. The enemy was still in the area, heavily armed, and their position was unknown. The mission was dangerous not only because of the injuries Shadow had sustained, but because the enemy was watching them closely, waiting for the perfect opportunity to strike. The jungle, dense with trees and thick underbrush, felt alive with the sound of distant gunfire and the whispers of the wind, carrying the smell of danger. James tried to push his nerves aside as he focused on the mission at hand. He had been on countless dangerous operations, but this one felt different. The further they ventured into the heart of the jungle, the more the weight of the mission pressed down on him. He had been through ambushes, high-speed chases, and firefights, but nothing compared to the quiet tension of this jungle. They moved swiftly, as shadows themselves, blending into the environment, making sure not to give away their position. The only sound was the crunch of the underbrush beneath their boots and the distant chirping of insects, which did nothing to ease the nerves of the men carrying out the operation. But it was the weight of the mission, not the jungle, that kept them on edge. They had one goal: rescue Shadow and bring him back to safety. At first, the mission seemed like it would be like any other. Extract the dog, get him back to base, and heal his wounds. Simple. But when they finally reached the area where the K9 had been pinned down, the sight before them was far more complicated than any of them had anticipated. Shadow was there, lying motionless in a small clearing, surrounded by a ring of spent shells and signs of the fierce battle that had taken place. The bloodstains on the ground were a stark reminder of the dog's courage. His fur was matted with dirt and soaked in his own blood, but his eyes were still sharp, even in the face of danger. The dog's loyalty was unquestionable. He had stayed put, guarding his handler, despite the odds. James pushed forward, kneeling beside Shadow. As he gently checked the dog's injuries, the rest of the team kept watch. They were trained for moments like this, but there was something that tugged at James' heart. His hand brushed against something cold and metallic beneath the K9's neck. The familiar feel of a tag. James froze. His heart skipped a beat. The tag, slightly twisted from the violence of battle, gleamed in the faint sunlight filtering through the dense canopy. With a trembling hand, James flipped it over. The name engraved on the tag made his breath catch in his throat. Lieutenant Alex Moore. The name hit James like a punch to the gut. His mind raced, and for a split second, time seemed to stand still. Lieutenant Alex Moore, his best friend, his brother in arms, the man who had been by James's side in countless operations, the man who had been his closest friend, someone he trusted with his life, the man who had died on the battlefield in a tragic ambush, leaving James alone in a way that no soldier should ever be. The weight of that memory came rushing back, as vivid as the day Alex had fallen. It was almost too much to process. Shadow, the dog he had been sent to rescue, the dog he was now tending to, as he lay injured in front of him, was Alex's dog. This wasn't just any military K9. Shadow had been Alex's partner. The bond between them had been as deep as the one James had shared with Alex. The reality of the situation hit him with a force he wasn't prepared for. He had spent years trying to move on from Alex's death, trying to bury the pain and the guilt that came with losing a friend in battle. And now, here he was, staring into the eyes of the one living thing that could bring all of those memories flooding back. James had seen a lot of things in his time as a soldier. He had fought through enemy lines, survived ambushes, and faced certain death more times than he cared to remember. But nothing had prepared him for this. Nothing had prepared him for this moment, when he realized that saving Shadow wasn't just about rescuing a military dog. It was about saving a piece of his past, a piece of Alex. The team worked swiftly to stabilize Shadow and prepare him for extraction. But as James watched the dog's chest rise and fall with shallow breaths, he couldn't shake the feeling that this mission was bigger than any he had ever been on. Why? Why had Shadow ended up here? Why had fate led him to this point? And why now, after all these years, was he standing here, holding the life of a dog that was connected to his best friend's death? He tried to focus on the task at hand, get the dog out safely. That's all that mattered now. But deep inside, a storm of emotions was raging. James had never talked about Alex's death. He had never shared the burden of that day with anyone. He had carried the pain in silence, convincing himself that time would heal the wounds. But deep down, he knew it was never that simple. And now, with Shadow in his arms, James was forced to confront those wounds once again. Shadow wasn't just Alex's dog. Shadow was the last living connection to his best friend. As the team made their way back through the jungle, James couldn't help but reflect on the path that had led them here. How had things come to this? How had he ended up on a mission to save a dog that was so deeply tied to his past? The mission to rescue Shadow wasn't just about the dog. It was about confronting the ghosts of the past, about finding a way to heal the broken pieces of his soul that had been shattered by loss. As they neared the extraction point, James's mind raced. He didn't know what the future held. He didn't know if Shadow would make it. But one thing was certain. This was a mission that would change his life forever. And perhaps, just perhaps, saving Shadow was the first step toward healing the wounds that had never truly closed. The dense jungle seemed to close in on James as they moved through the undergrowth. The weight of Shadow's injuries and the situation on his shoulders. The extraction point was just ahead, but James couldn't shake the images that flooded his mind. Memories of a time that seemed so far away, but in truth, it was only just beneath the surface, always lingering. As the team carefully carried Shadow, James's mind wandered back to the day Alex had been lost. The ambush had come without warning. 1 minute, they were on the move, doing what they did best, clearing the area, checking for threats. The next minute, everything had exploded into chaos. Bullets came from every direction. Screams filled the air. James could remember the sound of Alex's voice over the comms, telling him to stay close. It was too late. Alex had taken the brunt of the attack, shielding James from the worst of it. They'd fought together, side by side, like they always did. But that day, the day Alex fell, it wasn't just a blow to the mission. It was a blow to James's soul. The pain had been unbearable, and the guilt that he couldn't protect his best friend, was something James had lived with every single day since. Now here he was, holding Alex's dog, Shadow, a dog who had fought beside Alex on the day of his death, a dog who had been his last companion. James thought of Shadow's loyalty and the bond that had been formed in the heat of battle, and as he watched the dog struggle for each breath, he realized that this wasn't just a mission to save AK-9. This was about healing, redemption, and maybe, just maybe, finding a way to let go of the past. "How's he doing?" A voice interrupted James's thoughts. It was Sergeant Miller, one of the other men on the team. His voice was calm, but there was an underlying concern in his tone. "He's stable for now," James replied, glancing down at the injured dog. "But we need to get him out of here fast. The enemy is still too close." Miller nodded. "You're right. Let's keep moving. We'll make it to the extraction point." As the team pushed forward, James couldn't help but feel the weight of the situation. The jungle was becoming more hostile by the minute. The air was thick with humidity, and the distant sounds of enemy gunfire reminded him that time was running out. They had to get to the extraction point before they were caught in another ambush. But the further they went, the more James found himself lost in his thoughts. The mission was supposed to be straightforward. Save the dog, get out. But it was anything but that. Shadow's presence, the memories of Alex, haunted him. The connection between the two was undeniable. Shadow had been by Alex's side every step of the way, just as James had. The thought of Alex's death, of the final moments he spent in the field, made James's chest tighten. But it wasn't just the loss of Alex that had shaken him. It was the unresolved pain, the guilt of not being able to save his best friend, the anger at the universe for taking someone so good, the frustration of being unable to move forward. And now, here he was, with the last living piece of Alex. Shadow was more than just a dog. He was a reminder of everything James had lost, everything he had never truly been able to process. Every time Shadow stirred, James felt his heart beat a little faster. Was the dog in pain? Or was it something more? Was it a sign that Shadow was trying to tell him something? James could barely think straight. His emotions were all over the place. The weight of the past pressed down on him. The jungle seemed to close in, and the team's efforts to keep moving were growing more difficult as the minutes ticked by. At one point, they reached a narrow clearing, a break in the trees that allowed them to see the darkening sky above. But the clearing wasn't as safe as it appeared. James immediately heard the soft rustle of movement from the edge of the jungle. Enemy soldiers? He had no idea, but the hairs on the back of his neck stood up. "Take cover," he shouted. The team dropped to the ground, crouching low. James pulled Shadow close to him, trying to shield the injured dog from the possible threat. The rest of the team took up positions, weapons at the ready. They had been trained for moments like this, but as they listened, James couldn't shake the feeling that the danger was not just external. There was something deeper, something that gnawed at him from within. Minutes passed, but nothing happened. The jungle seemed to hold its breath. It was as if the world itself had paused, waiting. Waiting for what? James wasn't sure, but he knew that they couldn't stay here long. "James!" Miller's voice broke the silence again. "We need to move now. The extraction point isn't far, but we're losing daylight, and if we don't get Shadow out of here soon, the enemy will find us." James's gaze flicked back to Shadow, who had fallen unconscious again. The dog's chest rose and fell with each shallow breath. James felt the deep sense of responsibility weighing on him. He had to save Shadow. He had to save him not just because it was his mission, but because this dog, this last piece of Alex, was something he couldn't lose. He took a deep breath, steadying himself. "Let's go," he muttered, voice barely a whisper. The team moved again, this time faster and more cautiously. The threat of the enemy was always in the back of their minds. They had to move quickly but quietly. Every step felt like it could be their last. As they navigated through the thick jungle, James's mind began to race. The mission was starting to feel more like a personal journey, a battle not just against the enemy, but against the ghosts of his past. Alex had been his brother. They had shared everything, and now here James was, holding the dog that had shared that same bond with Alex. Shadow had been there through it all. He had seen the same horrors, fought the same battles, and lived through the same kind of pain that James had. But there was a difference. Shadow hadn't lost Alex the way James had. Shadow had lived. Shadow was still here. The thought of that, of Shadow being the last living piece of his best friend, overwhelmed James. It was as if the universe was handing him a second chance, not to save Alex, but to redeem himself, to heal. Every time he looked at Shadow, he saw Alex in the dog's eyes. The same loyalty, the same strength, the same spirit. But it wasn't just about Alex anymore. It was about James too, about his own healing. The guilt he had carried for years, the burden of being unable to protect his best friend. It was starting to lift, just a little. Saving Shadow wasn't just about the dog's physical wounds. It was about mending the wounds inside of James, the wounds that no one could see. As they neared the extraction point, the weight of the mission finally began to sink in. James's heart was still racing, his mind still clouded by the memories of Alex and the danger they were still in. But there was something else now, a sense of clarity, a sense of purpose. He couldn't change what had happened to Alex, but he could change what happened next. Shadow was still breathing, and that was enough. The extraction point was supposed to be a safe zone, but as James and his team neared it, he could sense that something wasn't right. It wasn't the usual adrenaline-fueled anxiety that came with a mission. No, this was different. This was something deeper. The jungle had begun to quiet, but the oppressive silence wasn't a sign of safety. It felt more like the calm before the storm. James kept his eyes peeled, scanning the horizon for any signs of movement. His fingers, though stained with sweat, gripped Shadow's body tighter. His heart was racing, but not from fear. This wasn't about the enemy anymore. It was about the moment that would decide not only whether Shadow survived, but whether James could come to terms with the ghosts that had haunted him for so long. They were close. The sound of rotor blades, chopping through the air, could be heard faintly above. The extraction helicopter was coming. The team pushed forward, their movements quicker, but more careful, like ghosts in the jungle. Every step seemed louder than it should be. Every rustle in the bushes sent a jolt of panic into James's chest. He tried to concentrate, but his mind kept slipping back to that moment, the day Alex had died. The ambush had come out of nowhere. They had been so sure of their position, so confident in the plan. But within seconds, The world had exploded into chaos. Alex had been in the front, as always, protecting his team. James had been right behind him. The enemy's fire came in waves. Shouts rang out, but it wasn't until a bullet tore through Alex's chest that James realized it was too late. He could still hear the sound of Alex's voice, even though the words were fading. "Get down, Jimmy. Get down." The image of Alex's face as he collapsed, the blood staining the sand beneath him. James had never been able to shake it. Every night since then, it replayed in his dreams, every second of it. And now, with Shadow in his arms, it felt as though he was holding on to that memory, that grief, that pain. But the memories were starting to fade, just a little. The guilt, that crushing, unbearable guilt, was still there. He hadn't been able to save Alex, but now, here he was, fighting to save the dog that had been Alex's companion, his last living tie to the man James had loved like a brother. As the team reached a narrow creek, the helicopter's blades were louder now, closer. James felt a sudden rush of hope. They were going to make it. They were going to get out of here. But just as he thought that, he heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps behind him. His heart sank. "Get down," he whispered to the team, his voice low but urgent. The team immediately hit the ground, weapons drawn, their eyes scanning the surrounding trees for any sign of movement. James hugged Shadow tighter, feeling the dog's body stiffen in his arms. The dog was barely conscious, but there was something in his eyes, something that told James the danger wasn't over. For a moment, the world seemed to stop moving. The sound of the helicopter blades grew louder, closer, but the noise only heightened the tension. Every crackle of the leaves underfoot, every flicker of movement in the trees made James's heart race. The jungle had become a battleground again, and this time, there was no Alex by his side. "Enemy." Miller's voice was barely a whisper. James nodded, his eyes narrowing. He couldn't see them yet, but he could feel them. The jungle was closing in on them, the enemy creeping closer with each passing second. "I don't know," James said, his voice steady despite the storm brewing inside him. "But they're here, and we need to move now." The team repositioned, their movements calculated. Every second felt like an eternity, and James couldn't help but glance at the sky, praying that the helicopter would make it here in time. The minutes stretched on, feeling like hours. James had no idea how much time they had, but it wasn't enough. It never felt like enough. And then, without warning, the jungle exploded in gunfire. It came from all sides. The crack of rifles filled the air as James's team returned fire, the sound deafening as bullets flew overhead. James's heart skipped a beat, but his training kicked in. He didn't have time to think. He had to move, had to protect Shadow, had to finish this. "Cover!" James shouted as the team dove for cover. He could hear the fire coming from both sides, the unmistakable sound of the enemy closing in. Shadow, still in his arms, was barely breathing now. James could feel the dog's body growing colder, more limp by the second. The team was holding the line, but they were trapped. The enemy had the high ground, and the jungle was thick with underbrush that made it impossible to get a clear shot. But as James crouched low, keeping himself shielded behind a fallen tree, his mind focused on one thing: the helicopter. It had to come. It must come. The battle raged on. Every gunshot echoed through the trees, and the air was thick with the acrid smell of gunpowder. James kept his eyes on the horizon, his pulse pounding in his ears. The pain in his chest was unbearable now, but it was no longer physical. It was emotional. His heart ached for Alex, for the past, for everything he had lost. And then, just as the situation seemed to be spiraling out of control, something incredible happened. The sound of the helicopter blades intensified, louder than ever. The whirring was so deafening that for a moment, James thought it might be a dream. But then, through the trees, he saw it, the helicopter, its rotors beating through the thick jungle air, coming in fast, swooping low over the treetops. "We've got a window," Miller shouted, his voice filled with a new surge of energy. "Let's move." The team wasted no time. They surged forward, using every last ounce of strength to fight through the jungle. James gripped Shadow, who was barely hanging on, and ran as fast as he could toward the helicopter. The world around him was chaos. Bullets were still flying. Shouts rang out. The enemy was closing in, but in that moment, it didn't matter. They were almost there. The helicopter was within reach. As they neared the extraction point, James could hear the sound of the door sliding open. The pilot was ready, the ropes dangling down, waiting for them to climb aboard. But they weren't out of the woods yet. The enemy wasn't backing down. They were still firing, still coming after them. But James didn't care anymore. All he cared about was getting Shadow to safety. He reached the ropes and hoisted the dog up. trying to be as gentle as he could despite the urgency of the moment. He could feel the dog's breathing growing weaker with every passing second, but they were so close now, so close to salvation. "Come on, buddy," James whispered, his voice breaking. "We're almost there, almost there." Just as he reached the helicopter, an enemy soldier appeared, charging from behind a tree, his rifle aimed directly at James. Time seemed to stop. The soldier's finger began to pull the trigger, but in a split second, another shot rang out, loud, final, and unmistakable. The soldier crumpled to the ground. James's heart stopped. He didn't know where the shot had come from, but the soldier was down, and the threat was over. The helicopter's door slammed shut, and in a matter of seconds, they were lifting off the ground, leaving the chaos of the jungle behind them. James collapsed into a seat, Shadow still cradled in his arms, his heart pounding. The mission was over. They had made it, but as he looked down at the dog in his arms, he realized that the hardest part wasn't the battle. It was what came next. The battle for Shadow's life, and for his own healing, was far from over. The helicopter's whirring blades cut through the thick jungle air as James cradled Shadow in his arms. The dog's shallow breaths, once sharp and labored, had finally started to stabilize, though he was far from out of danger. The enemy forces that had been hot on their heels were now just a fading memory. The jungle, with its dense canopy of trees and its eerie silence, was now far behind them, left in the dust. But in the quiet of the helicopter, the battle that raged inside James's heart was far from over. The team sat in near silence, their faces grim, the exhaustion of the mission hanging heavily in the air. They had made it out, yes, but at what cost? The mission had been a success in the most basic terms, but the true weight of it was just beginning to sink in. James couldn't shake the feeling of guilt that gnawed at him. Yes, they had saved Shadow. Yes, they had completed the mission, but it felt hollow. The emptiness in his chest was a constant reminder of the price he had paid for this victory. He had lost Alex once, and now the ghost of his best friend lingered in every corner of his thoughts. He glanced down at Shadow. The dog's fur, matted with blood, was a stark contrast to the calmness of the helicopter's interior. Shadow's eyes fluttered open for a brief moment, his gaze locking with James's. There was something in those eyes, a quiet understanding. It wasn't just a dog looking up at him. It was a bond, a connection that transcended words, a bond forged in the flames of battle, in shared pain, and in unspoken loyalty. James gently placed his hand on Shadow's head, his fingers brushing through the dog's fur. In that moment, something deep within him shifted. The weight of the world, the burden of loss, the guilt that had plagued him for so long, seemed to lighten just a little. He hadn't been able to save Alex, but he had saved this last piece of Alex's legacy. Shadow, the dog who had fought alongside Alex until the very end, was still alive, and that in itself felt like a victory. As the helicopter soared higher, the landscape below them sprawling out into an endless sea of green, James's thoughts began to quiet. The noise in his mind, the constant barrage of memories, the haunting image of Alex's face on the battlefield, all started to fade into the background. It wasn't gone. He knew it would never be completely gone, but it was lessened. The pain, while still there, felt more bearable now, and for the first time in a long time, James realized that maybe he didn't have to carry the weight of his past alone. The journey back to base felt like it took forever, but eventually, they landed. The helicopter touched down with a soft thud, the rotor blades slowly winding down as the soldiers disembarked. James stayed behind for a moment, holding Shadow, unwilling to let go of the dog, who had become his anchor. "Take care of him, Sergeant," one of the medics said as she approached, her voice soft but urgent. She extended her hands toward Shadow, ready to take over the medical care. James hesitated, his fingers tightening around the dog's fur. "I'll stay with him," James replied, his voice thick with emotion. "Just for a little longer." The medic nodded, understanding the gravity of the situation. She stepped back, allowing James's moment. The soldiers on his team had already started to disperse, but James remained where he was, sitting on the edge of the helicopter's open door, the wind tousling his hair as the sun began to dip below the horizon. In the stillness, he closed his eyes and allowed himself a brief moment of peace. It wasn't much, just a few seconds, maybe a minute, but it was enough for him to breathe, to process, and to reflect on what had just transpired. It had been a mission that started with one goal, save a dog, but it had become so much more than that. It had become an emotional journey of redemption, of healing, and of closure. As the medic carefully loaded Shadow onto the stretcher, James followed close behind. His heart was still heavy, but there was a glimmer of hope now. For the first time in a long time, he could see a way forward. Shadow had been through so much, but there was still life in the dog's eyes, and that was enough to spark a flicker of hope in James's heart. They took Shadow to the medical bay, where a team of veterinarians and doctors immediately went to work on him. James stood by, watching as the team worked tirelessly to stabilize the K9. But even as the doctors did their best to tend to the physical wounds, James knew that the emotional wounds would take time to heal. The hours passed slowly. James barely moved from his spot, not even when the rest of his team was debriefed and allowed to rest. His mind kept going back to Alex, to the moment when he had lost his best friend, and to the sense of responsibility that had plagued him ever since. He hadn't been able to protect Alex, hadn't been able to save him, but maybe, just maybe, this was his chance to make things right. The pain of losing Alex would never go away. It couldn't, but saving Shadow, saving the last piece of his best friend's legacy, was the closest thing to redemption that James would ever have. And while it might not fix everything, it was a step, a small but significant step. By morning, Shadow had stabilized. His breathing was stronger, and he was finally resting more peacefully. James stood by his side, watching the dog sleep, his heart still heavy, but now filled with a sense of accomplishment. He didn't know what the future held for him or for Shadow, but for the first time in years, James felt as though the weight of the past was starting to lift. Maybe, just maybe, he could move on from the guilt that had haunted him for so long. Maybe, just maybe, there was a way forward. Sergeant Carter. James turned to see Colonel Foster standing in the doorway of the medical bay, his expression unreadable. "Colonel," James said, standing up straight. "How is he?" "Better," Foster replied, his voice softening. "He'll make it. The dog's a fighter." James nodded, but it was clear that his mind wasn't on the dog anymore. It was on the journey he had just completed, the emotional toll it had taken on him, and the healing that had just begun. "You did good out there," Foster continued. "You saved that dog, and in doing so, you saved yourself." James didn't know how to respond. He didn't need words. Foster understood. They both understood. It was in that moment that James finally allowed himself to feel a small sense of peace. He had been through hell. He had fought in battles, both external and internal. He had lost friends, but in saving Shadow, he had found something unexpected: redemption, healing. For the first time, he realized that healing didn't mean forgetting. It didn't mean erasing the past. It meant accepting it, learning from it, and moving forward. He could never bring Alex back, but he could honor him by living a life that mattered, by carrying on his legacy in his own way. As James sat by Shadow's side, the dog's tail slowly wagged, weak but determined. It was a small sign, but it was enough to spark something inside of him, a feeling that, perhaps, the journey wasn't over. Maybe there was still hope. Maybe there was still more to be done. With Shadow beside him, James knew that he had not only rescued a dog, he had rescued a part of himself, the part that had been lost, the part that had been broken. And now, with the K9 by his side, they would face whatever came next, together. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and share this journey of loyalty and redemption with others. And if you want to see more incredible stories like this, check out our next video.